Rabbi Schulweis celebrated his 80th birthday. We wanted to give him a celebration that would be appropriate. We had a very singular problem. In the Jewish world, when you celebrate somebody, the way that you do it is you go find a bigger Jew to give them an award. So if you're a rabbi, you go find the head of the movement to give him an award. If you're a Jew, you find the rabbi to give them the award, right? But who are we going to get to honor Rabbi Schulweis? I mean, I look the world over. We don't have a pope. You knew that, right? You knew that. And the pope we had didn't want to come. He was Shomer Shabbos, and he wouldn't come. So we were too liberal for him. Anyway, so we tried, and I said, like, who are you going to get? So I decided what I would do is I said to Rabbi Schulweis, here's what I want to do. I want to get the 5 greatest Jewish teachers in the world in the same room. That's what I want to do. I'm only going to do this once in my whole life. I want to get the 5 greatest Jewish minds in the world together in one room. Who are they? So we made a list. So David Hartman, who at the time was very ill, but was willing to come via videotaping. Yitz Greenberg was a wonderful teacher. And Harold Kushner was a good friend of the rabbis. And David Ellenson. And they all came together. And on the 80th birthday, we had this remarkable symposium. And I got to publish it in a book. It's on a videotape. It's a remarkable moment. I faced the same problem this time as well. We have a legacy, which is a legacy that is going to last for generations and generations, a serious turning, a revolution in the thought of the Jewish people, in the life of the Jewish people, in the structure of institutions. Who do you know who has the perspective that could help us understand Rabbi Schulweis's legacy? And the only one I could ask was David Ellenson. Now, the David Ellenson, there's actually 3 David Ellensons. You need to know this. The first David Ellenson is the David Ellenson who is just finished his tenure, very, very successful tenure, as president of the Hebrew Union College, which is the academic arm of the Reform movement, who is professor of history, noted scholar of early modern Jewish history, author of books and articles, most of which I can't understand, and mentor to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of rabbis, cantors, teachers, and scholars. Then there's the David Ellenson, who's Jackie's husband, who is the father of, how many kids? 6, 7, 10, 12 kids now. Grandfather. One of them is a really, really good best-selling author. One of them was just installed as a rabbi in Seattle, my camper Micah. Remarkable, wonderful children, and a member of the community. And then there's the third David Ellenson, which is the reason he's here, which is David Ellenson, the neshama, a person of deep love, of deep affection, of deep reverence for our teacher, Rabbi Schulweis, and for profound and broad vision of what Jewish life ought to be. It is our privilege to have David and Jackie with us this Shabbos to celebrate and commemorate the Rabbi on his Shloshim and to try to find his place in the history of the Jewish people. Dr. Professor Rabbi David Ellenson.
Well, at least I got a tepid clap at this point. We'll see where you are at the end of the evening. Okay, a little more. No, just kidding. Anyway, it is really beyond an honor for me to be here. Rabbi Feinstein called me approximately 2 weeks ago. He got me right as I was heading on an airplane to Israel for a week, and when he told me what the purpose was for which he was inviting me, Malka, I, of course, said yes immediately. I said, now I'll check my schedule, but we moved a couple of things around, and it is a great, great honor for me to be here tonight. Our tradition teaches that if you learn afilu ot echad, you learn even a single letter from an individual, tzarich linhag bo kavod, you have to show that person respect. For Harold Schulweis, I and every one of us in this room learned much, much more than a letter. And the degree of kavod and the zechut that I feel in being able to speak this weekend and teach in his name and look at his writings with you here tomorrow on Shabbat is really one of the singular honors that I have received this year. Of course, it's only 2 weeks old, so. I thought when Eddie was going to introduce me and when he was talking about one needed a big Jew, I thought maybe I was the big Jew. I wasn't certain precisely where that would go, but my relationship with this congregation, this community, and with Rabbi Schulweis certainly goes back many years. My friend Rabbi Feinstein, my earliest relationship with them was that for many years, Jackie and I worked at family camp at Camp Ramah. I had heard there was a new director. I was with one of my children, I can't remember which one, in the laundry at Camp Ramah. There was a lovely, lovely woman named Nina who was in there doing laundry with a little boy named Rafi. That may be part of where we got the name Jackie, who knows. And later that night, after becoming so friendly with Nina, Jackie and I, and with Rafi, and later on the rest of the Feinstein clan, we heard the best storyteller I had ever heard, namely Rabbi Ed Feinstein tell stories around the campfire at Ramah, and a friendship was quite literally kindled at that campfire that has lasted now certainly for far more than 2 decades. In the Gemara, it does say that on the Shaloshim, Yehuda HaNasi, Judah the Prince, had said on his deathbed that 30 days after my death, assemble my students, Talmidai, and teach in my name. And of course, that is precisely what it is that we're going to do here this weekend. There's so many different ways and different books of Rabbi Schulweis's that I could describe, but I want to go back to a memory I have right here in this pulpit, in this bima. For a number of years, Rabbi Schulweis and Rabbi Feinstein invited me, before Rabbi Hoffman and others were here, and Noah, to come and serve as one of the substitute rabbis or additional rabbis on the high holidays. And the great highlight of that was, of course, that I would hear Rabbi Schulweis preach. And one of his sermons that I remember particularly well dealt with the whole issue of Jewish education, and he focused on a book. Some of you may have read it. It was called Tuesdays with Murray. Tuesdays with Murray. How many of you were here for that sermon? Murray, my Virginian accent. Tuesdays with Murray. Murray, okay. I'll get the name right, but everyone understands the book. I identified with the book for many reasons. The protagonist in the book, however you pronounce his name, suffered from ALS, Lou Gehrig's disease. And his student came to him every week and met with him on Tuesdays. My father had that disease. My father passed away at 55. He had that disease when he was 51, so I had read the book. And in fact, the first time I read it, I simply could not finish it. It was just too painful to actually read it. But as I heard Rabbi Schulweis talk, he described Mari or Murray? Mari. Okay. Mari. And he pointed out that Mari embodied every ethical quality that there was in the world. And he could cite every literature in the world to justify his stance, except one literature was missing. The literature that was missing was Jewish literature. And he chastised all of us, Rabbi Schulweis, and challenged us and said that our task, his task, our joint task, was to educate our people within our tradition, to enculturate them, to enculturate ourselves, so that as we came to understand what our place was in the world, we would do so through a Jewish lens. Not a Jewish lens alone, but that the Jewish lens would complement and inform the lenses that we would receive from the larger world. Tonight, there are a great many ways in which I could speak, and tomorrow I hope to look directly at Rabbi Schulweis's writings. But in light of the talk that he gave that night, that drashah, that sermon on Rosh Hashanah, I would like to call my talk tonight, quite frankly, Lunches with Harold. Because I had a great many lunches with him over the years. And as he wrote his books and published his papers, the topics that he discussed with me at lunch, I would later see quite literally in the pages of his books and in the pages of his writings. The first lunch I ever had with him, and I remember it vividly, was in September of 1979. I had just been appointed by my friend Rabbi Uri Hersher to the faculty of the Hebrew Union College here in Los Angeles. Uri had just come from Cincinnati to serve then as the dean of our Los Angeles campus, and he had hired me as a teacher of Jewish thought. The person whom I replaced as the professor of Jewish thought at HUC was a man named Harold Schulweis. I was not certain precisely how Rabbi Schulweis would greet me. I didn't know if he would regard me as a usurper or if he would see me as a welcome addition to this community. And of course, I did not know Rabbi Schulweis well at that point. He called me up, he invited me for lunch, and of course, I knew immediately with his warmth that I would be welcomed into this community as a precious colleague and as someone who could be his student. Our conversations began at that point, and I would say that over the 23 years that we lived here in Los Angeles, probably about every 6 weeks to 2 months, Harold and I would have lunch together. I must confess, and Uri and others can probably comment on this as well, I never recall him eating very much, or maybe the better way to put it would be, he ate very quickly because he had so many ideas that he wanted to discuss that except for the minimal amount of sustenance that he needed in order to have these ideas propelled through his entire being, basically, I would sit with him during the entire lunch and he would discuss all sorts of topics and cite all sorts of sources. One of the very first philosophical conversations that I ever had with him was a discussion about Baruch Spinoza. He was interested to know my view. Spinoza, in his work, The Theological Political Tractate, and I'll try to make this brief, but in the Theological Political Tractate, the point that bothered Rabbi Schulweis and that he raised with me was that Spinoza characterized religious ethics in general and Jewish ethics in particular as immature and unworthy. They were immature and unworthy because Spinoza felt that the basic thrust as to why it is that Jews would observe commandments was the result of reward and punishment. The result of reward and punishment. Think of the second paragraph of the Shema, for example. V'haya im shamoa. If you obey my commandments, God says, you'll get tirosh v'yitzar, the rain will come down in its season. From Spinoza's perspective, the problem with religious ethics is that they were an oxymoron. They might have been religious, but they were not ethical. They were not ethical if by ethics you mean that people do the right thing because, quite frankly, it is the right thing to do, and not because of a fear of reward or punishment. And Rabbi Schulweis quickly went on to say that Kant, in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, had made precisely the same point that Spinoza made. Namely, Kant, in the Foundations of the Metaphysics of Morals, made the point at the very beginning that the only thing we can say is truly good is a good will. Namely, it is intention. And he distinguished between what he would call moral activity and prudential activity or pragmatic activity. A prudential act is a wise act, and people need to learn to behave in a prudential fashion. But Kant would say, don't mistake that for an ethical act. A prudential act would mean that you do something because, quite frankly, it's the smart thing to do, but it's because essentially there's an ulterior motive, there's a reward you're going to receive. Whereas an ethical act, the categorical imperative which you recognize and then perform, you do because it is simply the right thing to do. When I think of this, and I used to lecture on this in my classes on Kant, after this discussion with Rabbi Schulweis, I would often think of my own children. I have a sister who used to live near a Disney store, and watching the Hoffman girls tonight, there were 3 little girls, and my sister would go to the Disney store and buy all the costumes. And whenever my sister would come to the house, the girls, in an almost Pavlovian kind of way, would start jumping up and down, Aunt Judy's coming. And they would hug her and kiss her, and she would distribute tons of Disney artifacts. Who was it in those days? The Little Mermaid. I think it was before Frozen became the... And I used to think to myself, well, now why are my girls saying thank you to Aunt Judy? There are kind of 2 motives, and they're probably mixed. One could be that it's prudential for them to do it if, in fact, they kiss Aunt Judy and say, we are really happy you're here and we love you. They're more likely to get gifts the next time. They're not stupid. Or could it be possible that deep within their soul, this is the process that goes on? They recognize, my aunt loves me. She is really kind and thoughtful and generous. And I have an emotion, a feeling, a sentiment that feels incredible gratitude for her kindness and generosity, and therefore words of hoda'ah, words of thanksgiving and gratitude, spring from my lips, and the girls say, Aunt Judy, I love you and thank you very much. Of course, the reality is that in real life, prudential motives and ethical motives are undoubtedly mixed with one another. How, when I look to Mina right now, or any other shrink who's here, how could you ever make a distinction between all the issues that motivate you to act in one way or another? But what was interesting about talking to Harold, and years later, when I read his award-winning book on conscience, and the obligation for duty that we had to observe our conscience, the lunchtime conversations that I had had with him in the 1980s appeared in the book. Namely, the problem, according to Rabbi Schulweis in his book on conscience, which won the National Jewish Book Award several years ago, was that people like Spinoza and Kant failed to fully understand what Jewish ethics and Jewish teachings were about. Quoting Pirkei Avot, he would say, Al tiyu ka'avadim hamashamshim et harav al manat lekabel pras. Don't be like servants, our tradition says, who serve their master in order to receive a reward. Ela havu ka'avadim hamashamshim et harav al manat lo lekabel pras. Serve your master because you recognize that it's the right thing to do regardless of the award or reward that you will ultimately receive. Namely, from Harold's point of view, the problem with Spinoza and Kant was that they created a caricature of what religion was about. For Harold Schulweis, religion was not a heteronymous, other-directed type of enterprise. Rather, religion asked us to recognize that which was good. It tried to point to that which was good and attempted to inculcate within us a sensibility that would allow us to act on the yashar v'hatov, on that which was upright and good, because it was the appropriate thing to do. At another lunch with Harold, he introduced me to a book which I later used in a course on the Holocaust at USC, and which has been for me one of the most influential books I ever read. But it was Harold who introduced me to it, and he was very excited because he thought that the book embodied another approach to this whole question of what religion could do than was true in the writings of Spinoza and Kant. The book was written by a man named Philip Hallie, or it could be Hallie. I'll let people pronounce it any way they want. Hallie, who was a professor at Wesleyan University, a professor of philosophy, and the book was entitled, Lest Innocent Blood Be Shed. Lest innocent blood be shed. And Harold could not contain himself at lunch as he described this book to me. The book was about the village of Le Chambon in France, and it is the story of where goodness occurred. What Harold was interested in was seeing, was there actually an empirical case that we could point to contra Spinoza and contra Kant, where you could see that people did the right thing. They displayed what he would later call, and what psychologists would call, the altruistic personality, because they recognized decency and goodness, and they did the right thing, regardless of even what was in their self-interest. In this village, and it is meaningful to talk about this, particularly in light of the events of the last few weeks. In this village in France, in August of 1940, immediately after the Vichy government was established, a minister got up named André Trocmé in a very tiny village, Le Chambon, and on that Sunday, he preached on the book of Deuteronomy. And he said, what we are going to do is to create here in Le Chambon an Ir Miklat. We are going to create a city of refuge. He took a passage from the Hebrew Bible that talked about the Arei Miklat, the cities of refuge in ancient Judea, in ancient Israel, where people could run and escape from the Goel Dam, from the blood avenger, if they were in fact innocent. And he said, we're going to create a village like that here, lest innocent blood be shed. Hallie then interviewed the people, and he described what it was that transpired. It was a small village. It was a Huguenot village in a Catholic country, and the people in this village had suffered persecution. Harold pointed out to me that what was crucial in their being able to exercise conscience and courage was that what these people ultimately had was empathy for people who were being unfairly persecuted. Just like in our Torah portion tomorrow. What is it that God says in the Torah portion tomorrow? Vayishma na'akasam, that God heard the groaning of the people of Israel. That what one needs is a sense of empathy for people who suffer. And what did these Huguenots do through their leader, André Trocmé? This small village said that it would set itself up as a city of refuge where if Jewish refugees could escape there, they would rescue these people and shelter them during the war. A resident of this city, Los Angeles, Pierre Savage, was born in that village and later produced a movie called Weapons of the Spirit that many of you may well have seen. But what was crucial about this, Rabbi Schulweis pointed out, was not only the planning, because about 6 weeks after the village had proclaimed itself and that news had gone out, at least to some Jews, Harold pointed out to me that he thought the highlight of the book came in the narrative about 6 weeks after Pastor Trachmé had delivered his sermon. That suddenly, one night after midnight, Pastor Trachmé and his family and his closest associates had heard that they were going to receive their first Jews. And everyone now was nervous, because now the problem wasn't simply one of stating a theoretical kind of posture, but now a Rubicon was about to be crossed. Because once they harbored Jews, who knew what the punishment would be? And in fact, one of Trachmé's, a number of his relatives, were put to death by the Nazis. And in a very powerful passage in the book, which Harold read to me at lunch, there was a knock on the door, and everyone in the room understood these are Jews who are coming for refuge. And everyone in the room froze. Pastor Trachmé, his associates. The one person who did not freeze was Mrs. Trachmé. She went to the door. She opened it. She saw this couple with their children, said, "Come, you must be hungry, you must be tired. You enter our door, we will feed you, and we will clothe you." I am positive later on when I read Harold's book on conscience, and he begins the chapter with talking about Spinoza and Kant and Freud's notion of how aggressive human beings are and how the superego really cannot tame the id, that when he suddenly begins to move to rescuers in the Holocaust, that I realized there was a direct line from that lunch 25 years ago and the book that he wrote and the activities in which he engaged, whether it was the foundation that he would come to establish that would recognize rescuers, or whether it be the work that he has done much more recently with people in Darfur. For Harold Schulweis, theology, Jewish religious ethics, are not simply an academic matter. To quote Catholic parlance, Harold always engaged in applied theology. How do you take the teachings of a tradition and have people act on them in the world? And you here at Valley Beth Shalom were his major classroom, but his classroom extended far beyond. On a personal level, there were other lunches I had with Harold. In 2000, 2001, I was considering the position of president of Hebrew Union College, and I did not know whether to, in fact, leave what was, for Jackie and me, such a wonderful life and a wonderful community, and assume this position. Certainly, I cannot even begin to describe how many conversations I had with my friend and mentor, Uri Hersher, about this. But Harold Schulweis was another person who I approached, and I suspect that Harold and Uri might have discussed my becoming president more than on one occasion. And I came here for lunch with Harold, and I told him my dilemma. I said, you know, I'm really very happy being a professor. We have friends in this community. I've never engaged in fundraising. I've never done administration. I don't really know what it would be like. And Harold began to talk to me about notions of covenant and covenantal responsibility and what it would mean to serve the Jewish people and humankind in a different capacity than, in quotes, just being a professor. And I guess between Harold Schulweis and Uri Hersher, now it's 14 years later, and I've done it and moved to the other side. But Harold certainly played a crucial role in teaching me again that what it is that you do in the world comes to be most significant. As Harold put it, the most important element in Jewish religious teaching and what makes it distinct from simply academic learning is that what is it you do as a Jew? Lilmod u'lelamed lishmor v'la'asot. That the task we have is to study and to teach, but then to observe and to do. It is the deed that becomes primary. And I'll conclude with one story, one last story of one lunch, and then one last teaching in his honor. In 2005 or 2006, I had been invited to be a manche, to be a madrich, a guide, for a group of rabbinical students, 19 rabbinical students from 7 different seminaries. It was a trip sponsored by the American Jewish World Service, and we were in El Salvador. And we dwelt in a little village in El Salvador. The conditions were ones of extreme poverty. I thought it was important for me to go on this trip, but I will be honest, there were members of my board who were completely opposed, saying, how can you take 10 days away from fundraising and administration to be with 19 students in a village in El Salvador? And I actually called Harold up and said, what do you think? And Harold said, what do I think? He said, I think it isn't that you should go on this trip, you have to go on this trip. And when you get back from this trip, you tell me what you've learned. And so on my subsequent visit to Los Angeles after I did this trip, I told Harold the following story. The first day we had worked out in the fields, and I think I didn't really listen sufficiently to all the instructions we had received, and I did not drink sufficient water. And I became extremely sick that night. In fact, I could not even teach the very next day. We would eat our dinner meals in the homes of these villagers. And I was with one other student who was a young man, a student at the Jewish Theological Seminary. And this is the story I told Harold. That night after we had dinner, I became extremely, extremely ill. And frankly, I don't want to be overly vivid, but I was regurgitating on the road, this dark, dusty dirt road in something close to a godforsaken village in El Salvador with no lights, no streets, just dirt. And I apologized to the student. And the student said to me, well, you don't really need to apologize. And I went, well, I feel badly that I'm ill. I haven't been able to teach. And he said, it's okay. He said, I'm used to people throwing up. I wasn't quite sure what he meant. And he said, I had cancer. And he talked about having gone through his radiation and his treatments. And I'm sure it played a very significant role in leading him to rabbinical school at the seminary. So I learned something about him that I would never have learned otherwise. And it taught me a degree of empathy, not only for him, but quite frankly, even some degree of empathy for myself. But then we started to talk, and I said, well, why are you here? Why are you here? I said, do you think we're going to eradicate world poverty? And the student said to me, no. He said, I don't know if we're going to make any real difference. But he said, I'm about to become a rabbi. And he said, this much I do know. It is crucial as a rabbi, I need to know how is it that I'm going to stand before God? What are going to be the values that will motivate me? And he said, I think this trip will help teach me that lesson, how to stand before God. I think the reason that all of us loved Harold Schulweis so very, very much is that Harold taught us, maybe more than any rabbi, or any other teacher what it meant to have ultimate values, what it meant to act on those values, Harold taught us in the end what it meant to stand before God. In the words that I wrote for the eulogy for Harold, most of which was read here in that very, very powerful funeral ceremony that I was only able to watch because I was unable to be here that day, there was a teaching, and I would conclude my words about Harold tonight with that teaching. In the Shulchan Aruch in Orach Chaim 151, it says, by the way, that it is forbidden generally to have a funeral in a synagogue. Synagogue is a makom kadosh, it's a holy place, and you cannot have a funeral or place a casket within a synagogue in general. The only exception for that is when the individual who is being eulogized is a person of exceptional deeds and actions, someone who fought on behalf of the Jewish people and on behalf of all humanity, who was devoted to the land of Israel, and who was devoted to goodness in his thought and in his deeds. For such a person, who is as strong ka'ari, as strong as a lion, it is not only permissible to have the funeral and to have the casket in the synagogue, it is a mitzvah to praise and honor a person in this way. For those of us who knew Harold Schulweis, and especially for you, Malka, the loss of his physical presence, his active spirit, his active voice is monumental. I think of my conversations, yours that began when I think you were a 17-year-old girl with him, sitting at the Cultural Center, planning it, working with Harold, Uri, Stanley Chiat about what the core exhibition would be and what it would say. These things are irreplaceable. And yet, as Harold himself wrote, what we are left with is ultimately the gift of memory. And there's an eternality that surrounds that memory. That on this weekend, as we remember his writing, Siftotav Dovavot Min HaKever, his lips continue to move, and they provide us instruction, as they will for days, weeks, months, and years to come, decades to come, that will help us understand what our place in the world not only is, but as Eddie said, as our present generation and future generations confront issues, what our place in the world should be. Rabbi Harold Schulweis was a blessing for me, a blessing for the Jewish people, and a blessing for humankind. He understood the Jewish tradition demanded that we take great pride in our covenantal obligations as Jews, but that we had to also understand that we have covenantal obligations to all of humankind, that God stands in relationship, not only to us as Jews, but that God stands in relationship to all persons of all colors, races, and creeds. For these reasons and for so many more, Yehi Zichro Baruch, Harold Schulweis's memory will remain a blessing. I look forward to studying his writings with you tomorrow. Shabbat Shalom.
Rise together and conclude the service, Kiddush, Aleinu, and we'll recite Kaddish together.
Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, borei peri hagafen. Baruch atah Adonai, Eloheinu melech haolam, asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'ratzavanu, v'shabbat kodsho ve'ahavahu ratzon hinchilanu, zikaron ציוונו בחרת, ואותנו קידשת מכל העמים, ושבת קודשך באהבה וברצון הנחלתנו. ברוך אתה אדוני מקדש השבת.
Page 51, Aleinu.
עלינו לשבח לאדון הכל, לתת גדולה ליוצר בראשית, שלא עשנו כגויי הארצות, ולא שמנו כמשפחות האדמה, שלא שם חלקנו כהם, וגורלנו ככל המונם. עומדים לפני מלך מלכי המלכים, הקדוש ברוך הוא שמונותי שמיים וזרז. ככתוב בתורתך, אדוני ימלוך לעולם וערב, ונאמר, והיה אדוני מלך על כל הארץ, ביום ההוא, ביום ההוא, יהיה אדוני אחד, ושמו
This week, there are those among us who bear the grief of the loss of loved ones. We welcome them to the synagogue and pray that you find comfort and peace in the words of this tradition and the embrace of this community. There are those who remember the yard sites, the yearly anniversary of the death of loved ones, and gather their wisdom and love. And this week, all of us gather together in memory of our dear teacher on the occasion of his Shloshim. Yitgadal v'yitkadash shemei Rabbi. V'yalma divrach chirutei v'yamlich malchutei b'chaye echon v'yom echon v'chaye dechal beit Yisrael ba'galao v'zman kari v'yamru amen. Yehei shmei Rabba mevarach leolam ol me'el maya yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnasei v'yithadar v'yitaleh v'yitalal shemei dekudsha brichu le'elam min kol birchata v'shirata Tushbechata v'nechamata, damiran be'alma v'yimru amen. Yehei shlama rabba min shemaya, v'chayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Oseh shalom b'mromav, uyaseh shalom aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'yimru amen. Please be seated. Just a moment of procedure before we conclude our service. Our very special thank you to Cantor Barron, to Chris Harden, our music director, and to the gentlemen of the band. Thank you all for sharing your talents with us tonight. A very, very warm and special thank you to David Ellenson, and a welcome to David and Jackie, who will be with us during the course of the weekend. Once again, a thank you to Alana Zimmerman for all of her efforts in putting this Shabbat together, to Bart Pacino and members of the synagogue staff. To all of you, thank you so very, very much. Following the service, we're all invited to an Oneg Shabbat, to a little bit of dessert, and that's going to be held in Glazer Hall, which is just behind us. And as the rabbi's tradition, one of Rabbi Schulweis's great revolutions in the construction of Jewish liturgy was doing Friday night Israeli dancing. Now, some of us haven't done Friday night Israeli dancing since 1972, but we can a little slower, and we'll creak a little more, but Susan North-Gilboa is here to teach us tonight, so we'll enjoy a little bit of dancing and some sweets to celebrate this wonderful life and the occasion to be together. So please join us in Glazer Hall as we conclude. Tomorrow morning, we will begin Torah study at 9 a.m. in the Sher Lapati Hall. Dr. Ellenson will be teaching us in the morning. We'll be talking about Rabbi Schulweis in the perspective of American Jewish history. Following that, services here in the Nizhnik Sanctuary. the bat mitzvah of Genevieve Kaplan. Dr. Ellenson will speak a little bit at services at the end. We'll have lunch, and then after lunch at 12:30 back in Sher Lapati, a second opportunity to learn with David, and we'll be talking about Rabbi Schulweis as a religious philosopher, religious thinker, and his revolution in Jewish religious thought. So join us for that learning tomorrow. It's all a very special opportunity to learn all together. You'll find in the synagogue Shabbaton all the announcements for the week. There are lots of things going on in the congregation in the days to come. In the spirit of Rabbi Schulweis, nothing stops. There's so many more opportunities for Jews to grow and to learn and to celebrate Judaism. So please enjoy these activities and join us for all of these. I want to welcome all of you on behalf of the President of the congregation, Nancy Sher-Cohn, and the 24 former presidents who sit in this room. Thank you for allowing me to do announcements tonight. A very special welcome to our dear friend Rabbi Eli Hersher and Bonnie from Stephen Weiss Temple, and Dr. Uri Hersher and Mina from the Skirball Center, and Rabbi Bergman, my teacher. Thank you for joining us. Your presence honors us tonight. Any other announcements? Good. We rise all together for closing prayer. Adon Olam.
Adon Olam, Asher Malach, B'terem Kol, Yitzir Nivra, Eik Nasa, V'chefso Kol, Azai Melech Shemo Nikra, Ve'acharei so cold, Ala Melech Shemo Nikra, Don't know love, Shermana, Terem Kol, Sir Nivra, Yet Nasa, Kept so cold.